recording. So this one is about terrorism and what does it mean to be a terrorist, um, and how terrorism and terrorists are treated as boogeymen who are like around every corner. They're always out to get you. They're not treated as humans. They're dehumanized as people because they are once we class someone as a terrorist, and even when we class someone as a general criminal, we tend to take away their humanity as a society. And I'm recording this one now. Again, I have multiple, but because of the conversations around terrorism that are going around now with the current administration, and how they are using this term, to really just try to do whatever they want to do, and how this was honestly predictable. Like during 9/11, post 9/11, this was like a very predictable outcome. I may have been only 10, and even I still remember the debates about what are we going to do if we pass the Patriot Act? Like how many of our civil liberties will be destroyed? Because the second you label someone a terrorist, the American government will treat you as you've never had a single human right in your life. So, how did terrorism become this dehumanizing label? If you watched some of my things before, again, I only have like three up, but if you watch some of them before, I like to have a lot of backing. So, I want people to understand what the word means and then what the point it is I'm trying to get to. And you can't understand that without starting at the source. Like if you've ever wanted to, especially again in this political climate, like if you've ever wanted to like study like legislation, a lot of times you need to go back to the legislative history to truly understand the intent of the legislation. So that's not the most um it's not the most important thing to cite, but when it gets really dicey, every now and then you'll see lawyers cite the intent to legislation. And again, I my actual practicing is a little is far back. I've mostly been in house for a few years. So let's start with the origins. The origins of terrorism comes from the reign of terror in France. Ooh, look at my head in the way. Ooh, there we go. The origins of terrorism comes from France, and it's Robespierre, who was one of the leaders of the revolution in France, the bourgeoisie revolution. He stated that if the basis of a popular government in peacetime is virtue, it's the basis of time of revolution is virtue of terror. Virtue without terror would be barbaric, and terror without virtue would be impotent. Robespierre. I am reading this on a very smaller screen than what it looks like to y'all. It's like very tiny. And that was the first time we've used terror. And it is so important to call out the virtue aspect because, again, we're talking about what it means to dehumanize someone, what it means to be human. And a part of that is what is virtue. Your virtue is what divides you between a barbarian and a civilized person. And even though, again, none of that should matter. Oh, see, I already got a strike. Yes, let me get back to where I was. So, because of this division between barbarism and civilization, we have seen what that has done to society before. So, even the Romans would declare people they didn't like barbarians or people who were not Romans barbarians. It wasn't necessarily a race thing. This was before the modern construction of race. It was Roman versus not Roman, right? So we get into colonization, we get into the Western expansion, we get into the discovery of the New World, and we create not me, but the Europeans create this idea of reinforcing the idea even more of who is and isn't human through the idea of civilized versus uncivilized. And we can see, but even before like in the middle of this, we see the Irish Rebellion against the British. And so a few years later, the British defined terrorism as a systemic use of terror as a policy as a response to the Irish rebellions against colonization. Now, does it matter to the British that they were invading the Irish lands? Did it matter to the British that the Irish were simply fighting for their rights, trying to stop the monarchy from taking over their lands? Um, no, because it doesn't matter what your enemy is to a colonizer. Your enemy is not human. So why would you have virtue, right? So the Irish rebellions were denied the virtue which Robespierre was talking about. We hear the word terrorism. In the context of the French Revolution, you had this bourgeoisie revolution that was not necessarily for the working people, for the peasantry. It was for the middle class of France, who were tired of the monarchy and aristocracy, the monarchy taking over, taking too much power, taking too much money. And so working class people, peasants at the time, people were mostly peasants. So working class people and peasants did not have the virtue, they did not have the civilized identity that was required for your violence to be acceptable. They were just uneducated and barbaric. I hope this is like readable, even though I made it so small. And so what we see is colonization started before we really used terror. Like I said, the first time we hear terror, according to what I have found, was in the context of the French Revolution from Robespierre. But we can see the Western terrorism going during the entirety of colonization. The Mau Mau Rebellion, which was way after the French Revolution, was include. What am I doing? So the Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya, I cannot talk. The Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya, and the British tortured and killed hundreds of thousands of indigenous peoples in Kenya. This was not like some major thing where the Mau Mau had like major backings. This was just an onslaught of genocide. The British tried to play up the violence in the same way that people still do especially in the context of Palestine, where they were like, well, if they didn't want us to kill this village, they wouldn't have been in a village, but they were just killing random people. In the context of slavery was could have been considered terrorism, but because again the colonizer believed they had the virtue to do this, they enslaved millions of people, Africans and indigenous Americans, and killed so many more people. We don't really understand how many people may have died during the slave trade. We also don't know how many people outside of slavery, just the genocide of indigenous Americans, how many people actually died. I think the numbers are up to like 200 million right now. And then after colonization, we have neocolonialism, which is found throughout the world. It's found in Africa, particularly in the American context. It is found um, during our like our Latin, our Monroe Doctrine. I've talked about the Monroe Doctrine on here before. So during the Monroe Doctrine, we decided that Latin America was our backyard, Latin American and the Caribbean. And so neocolonialism isn't the government or the foreign government, the say, for example, the U.S. government stating that we are going into this country, we physically control the governments of these countries. The government is just a puppet for us. Like they're not sending a governor to Colombia. They are sending in, they can send in some military, they can send in mercenaries, they can use their money, they can back some type of paramilitary, but it's not physical, actual colonization. They don't have like an official physical presence in that country. And during these neocolonialist expansions, millions of people have died again. During the Guatemalan Civil War, which was backed by the United States, there was a genocide against the Mayans. Um, and it was just nonstop violence, right? And so then, we're not post neocolonialism, but in the context of domestic violence, we have state brutality. All of these are excused by the state because they are said to be, again, virtuous. We have to do this to these people. These people are not deserving of kindness and care. They are not deserving to be free of violence. They are simply um, they are simply people who deserve this, and we will always be right, no matter how violent we become, no matter how many people we enslave, no matter how many people we kill. And so, like I've said before, I think I started with this. I actually had to stop my recording because TikTok was flagging it for being unoriginal. So at the beginning, I stated that one, this is a recording for YouTube. So I'm recording this from YouTube, even though it's a TikTok live. I just thought this would be an interesting way to do this. But like I said earlier, I like to start a debate, start an argument, start a discussion with the definitions. So we've gotten into the original intent of the word, but what is terrorism? Each country has a different definition of terrorism. They all kind of float around the same area, but there's not one single definition for terrorism. Even the UN itself does not have a definition for terrorism. Hello, Kennedy and Carrington. Even UN, even the UN does not have an official definition of terrorism. The UN Security Council, which is the council that the United States is always like nope, we are not going to stop genocide. They have a definition. And so let me see if I want to read like at least like two of these. So the UK definition is as the use or threat where they are designed. Look, I got striked again. Designed to influence the government or an international governmental organization or to intimidate the public. In the US, international terrorism is a violent act committed by individuals or groups who are inspired by or associated with designated foreign terrorists or organizations or nation states. Domestic terrorism is the violent criminal acts committed by individuals or groups to further ideological goals stemming from the domestic influences, such as those of political, religious, social, or racial nature. And the other two are very similar. I think it's important to note that the UN refuses to define terrorism because of what I am getting to, where it is very vague. So, what does it mean to be a threat to the government, right? Like, what does it mean to intimidate the public? If I am protesting, am I intimidating the public? If I like if I'm protesting the government and am I intimidating the public? We'll see like a lot of time in France you'll see like very large protests, and so in the United States what they call that terrorism, right? Because there's a threat, but like there should be some type of physical act as well. But my point of this is that this is not a word that should even be used. So here are the key factors. There are a few papers. One of the papers is called The Impossibility of Defining Terrorism. So this points out that even though these definitions are not exactly the same, there are five key points that each definition has to meet. And it's not, again, it's not the point. The point isn't that the definition is like inclusive. The point is, thank you, Karen. See you later. The point of the definition isn't that it is something that is strict. It is something that can involve anywhere. So this person is talking about like how, regardless of where you go, if somebody the government doesn't like, they can just declare them a terrorist. So the first point of political purpose. The first point of terrorism is the political purpose. Acts must have a political aim to be considered terrorism. That means that this person needs to be like, hey, I'm doing this in the act of because I want X, Y, and Z. Again, that is very vague. There must be a perpetrator's identity, so that identity must be something that may be a part of a larger group, part of some type of larger ideology, and then the target person has to have also be a part of some type of group, have whatever they're influencing, whatever it is that they are being targeted for. That identity is important. So technically, like attacking some random dude on the street would it not be terrorism? But if you attack somebody because you're a part of this random organization over here, and you attack this person because of their ideology and you want to influence the government by doing this, that is how the identity aspect works. And then the harm threshold. The acts must be sufficiently harmful. There's another problem with that. What does that mean? So, and on the last page, you'll see that the British definition just says intimidation. The French one uses violence. I think the UN Security Council one also used violence. But the what is intimidation versus violence, right? So this is very still very vague. And then the methods are also considered to be important. So the methods employed by the perpetrators are a distinguishing factor. What does that mean? Again, this is pretty much nonsense. What are the methods? What makes something a terroristic act, and or what makes something just a violent act? If we have someone who has like jumped somebody in the street, is that an act of terrorism? Some people, as we were watching the news or watching current events, they would probably say at this point yes, but that's what makes the actual definition or the actual word so dangerous, because all of this could literally apply to anyone. We'll see. You can see the same thing when it comes to hate crimes. So any state, oops, any state that has passed hate crime laws, those hate crime laws are more often used against people of color than they are used against white people, because the law is very vague. There's also a question about like, do you need an extra law that's called a hate crime law when you've already committed a crime? But oftentimes, especially I think the last case I read about it was California. These black kids attacked a white man, and it was like, F you, white man. And they were charged with a hate crime. But the kids say they weren't just like attacking him because he was white. They were just like talking crap, and that's just what they said in the moment. It wasn't like meant to be a hate crime. But that's what happens when we create these laws, when we create these things that are so vague. We claim it's for some type of specific purpose, but then it starts applying to all of us. So again, being 10 years old when the Patriot Act was passed, I'm a kid, but I can still see the adults saying how overreaching this was, right? And so the Patriot Act and what followed it created the Department of Homeland Security. It created an entire department just for for immigration, for terrorism, and everybody knew that was a bad idea because we can't define these words. We already had the FBI, we already have police, we already have the army. Why did we need something specifically for this particular issue? All right, and so since this was created, like I said, a few years ago, at this point, this is in the context of Palestine, and it is very sad that it is still honestly relevant today. This has been going on for 2 years now. The anniversary was this week. So the genocide of Palestinians have been going on for like 70 years. But this particular instance has been going on for 2 years. So in the context of Palestine, which is what this was originally about, is that when somebody can be racialized, when somebody and their religion can be ostracized, that is such an easy way to dehumanize somebody. And so it does not matter, or it does not matter how many Palestinians are killed, because it is considered the Israelis who are pretty much racialized as white. No matter what they do, they will be virtuous. Like back to Robespierre, the act of violence they commit will be virtuous because we have decided as the white people in the Middle East, they are the most civilized people in the Middle East. You'll always hear that, you always hear like, oh, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. And it's just simply not true. But also, what does being a democracy have to do with having your own your own human rights, right? So the Palestinian meet these, like if we're using the definitions of what's happening to the Palestinians, they meet this definition. They have the harm threshold. There have been 800 people forced to flee since 1948, and that is the largest refugee crisis in the world. 5 million people are considered refugees. Some of them are actually internal refugees. So if you got pushed to Gaza or the West Bank and you were not allowed to go into what is now Israel and like resettle and like return to your homes, that makes you an internal refugee. And so we have the harm threshold, we have the deaths, we have the targeted identity. The targeted identity is Palestinians. We have the perpetrator's identity. The perpetrator's identity are the Israelis. It's also most of the Western world who are providing the weapons to the Israelis. Ooh, something is blocking my screen. 1 second. Oop, how do I move this? Okay. And so no matter that it doesn't matter that the Palestinians reach this threshold, because we have decided, again, they don't have the right to this virtue. And if you don't have virtue, you are not human. And so we have been conditioned, the average person who's watching the news have been conditioned to see a brown person on TV, to see a brown person who is fighting back against what they themselves would consider to be terrorism, and call that terrorism within itself. And so we can watch how the media, how media and politicians try to deflect from what is happening to the Palestinians as the targeted identity, to how they try to like switch the Palestinians to the perpetrator's identity. And so this says politicians and policymakers may use the term terrorism selectively, influencing public perception and leading to policies that disproportionately affect marginalized communities. And media shifts who the perpetrators are of violence and who the targets are. And so the inability, the lack of desire to treat Palestinians like people who can be harmed, who like people who suffer. It doesn't matter how many children you see suffering from the war, suffering from bombs, suffering from gunshots, because the news has decided that these people are no longer human. As long as the news and as long as politicians continue to call them terrorists, they will always just be that, because we have allowed as a society to allow people to be labeled something, and then that label completely deflects from whatever humanity they have. I would say even if they were terrorists, that does not mean that you can eliminate them from the face of the earth. And so these are just things to consider. I push back against people like the label of criminal. I don't care what the actual act was, but to label someone criminal does not like remove them. It does not stop criminality. It does not stop any more harms from happening. It just allows you to mentally disconnect from the fact that this is a person and a human being did what this did. It also allows you to think that you could never be a criminal. You can never be a terrorist. But we are seeing that. So like I said, I wrote this a while ago. So if we get into the context of what the current administration is doing with Portland, is there another page to this? If we get into the context of what the current administration is doing with Portland, what they're doing with Chicago, they're labeling stuff like kids kicking tear gas back to the officers who are shooting at them as terroristic actions. They are labeling people walking around in little inflatable suits as terrorism because that is an intimidation. And they're saying the target identity are the ICE officers or the government, and the perpetrator's identity is Antifa, which is strange. I'm not sure why you would. I feel like if the news actually cared, they would say, so you aren't anti-fascist, like you're pro-fascist, but the news is never going to do that. And so that's how like all of this ties in. When we allow people just because they're brown, just because they may fight back against a stronger power, just because they may fight back at all, when we allow them to be labeled as dehumanized with dehumanized labels, we are even hurting ourselves, because the second you take away somebody's humanity, your humanity can be taken away. We are all human, and we should not let these little slippery slopes slide by. That was a diatribe from what this presentation is saying. Let me move this again. So, as I've said like a few times, violence must be virtuous, but who is allowed virtue? Why don't Palestinians have the right to self-defense? If self-defense is a human right and human rights are for humans, again, you're telling me that these people aren't humans. And it's not just Palestinians, it's African Americans, it's indigenous peoples everywhere around the globe. It is people who may be leftists who are trying to fight for like our basic rights like healthcare. It is anyone who is a part of any group that the people in power, the government, anyone who just has like a lot of power over you. If they determine that you don't have the right to self-defense, they have completely denied your humanity to you. And so this is, let me see, hold on, wait, I forgot what this was. Well, this is basically everything I just said before. And so, yeah, this is like the methods used. I didn't get to this one. So the methods used by Palestinians are mostly like rocket attacks, right? Like, so they may have makeshift rockets that they have built by hand, while their attacker has F-55 planes. I think that's what F-55 is. They have planes, they have bombers, they have dropped more bombs on these people than during any other war. Palestinians had paragliders, and these people had jets. They have drones. These drones hover over communities nonstop. The communities are terrified because the sound of the drones outweigh the sound of anything else, and so they never know when they're going to be attacked, right? But somehow the person with the rocket, the makeshift rocket, is more scary than the person with the bombs, right? And so we see the lack of accountability. We see what it means to be in this position as Palestinians, because if you are not a victim, which they are not being treated as, so they're not being treated as victims, they're being treated as the perpetrators. And so since you're not a victim, you can't seek accountability, which is like another big thing. I don't know what's going to happen with this like alleged ceasefire. But I don't think included in the idea of this ceasefire that the Palestinians will receive anything. And you can tell just based from like how the UN proceedings have been going, that the people who are doing this to them, including the US, do not want them to have any type of accountability. They do not want these people to seek any type of retribution. They don't even want to sanction these people because, again, if they are not human, they are not owed any of this. If you know anything about the UN Human Rights, the UN Human Rights Commission, and then the courts, you go to court, you take your perpetrator to court, usually the state, some type of state. You take the state to court, you sue them, and if you win, you get something back. And you get that, again, I sound so repetitive, but you get it as a human. And so this double standard allows the states to continue their actions without facing significant international repercussions, further perpetrating the cycle of violence and dehumanization. We honestly see that again, we see that everywhere. I will say a lot of Latin countries, I know I've studied Latin America a lot, when they have sued their states, like I think, for example, Brazil, women in Brazil sued the Brazilian government in the international courts, and it was over femicide in Brazil, and they won. They actually had to change laws in Brazil because the court decided that, yes, actually, Brazil, it's not that you're, like, it's not the state that is committing the crime, but you aren't helping. There's also probably some shady police officers in there as well. But like that is something that people receive, right? But in the United States, we don't really get that. Like, we don't get to sue the United States government in the international courts. We don't get the ability to have, we don't get the ability to get that kind of thing. And it has some stuff to do with treaties. It has something to do with that. I think the U.S. is a party to treaties that would allow that, but they still don't do it because they think they're above everybody else. And so there have been a few times when African Americans have gone to the UN to try to sue for reparations, but because the United States just still doesn't really think slavery is bad because they don't see us as human, they just brush it off, right? I think the UN even may have declared that, I think they declared that the occupation of Hawaii as a state is also illegal, but the United States doesn't care. I think this is my last slide. Let me see what's this part. It says the label of terrorist facilitates the justification of extreme measures such as bombings and blockades against Gaza. The actions are framed as necessary to combat terrorism, despite the significant civilian casualties they cause. So, for every hostage that was taken on October 7th, how many lives of Palestinians have been taken, as if thousands of Palestinian lives are less significant than one Israeli life? This is not like a one-to-one comparison that we see because the lack of humanity. It says Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996 has been enforced almost exclusively against the Muslim community, reinforcing the stereotype that all terrorists are Muslims. I forgot that I put that in there, but the death penalty is so bad, right? The death penalty is not only like, this is specifically about terrorism, but the death penalty in general is mostly used against black men. And I actually got into a argument in the comments with this person because a woman was convicted, and she was like the first woman in like 20 years that, not convicted, but like she's about to be murdered. So this woman has been on death row for a long time. I think she was like the first woman in like something like 200 years. I don't know what was going on, but it's been a long time. And so someone is like, I was like, well, how do you like take a life for a life? Like, doesn't like all you Christians like doesn't the Bible say that's wrong? And they're like, no, because she's a criminal. I'm like, but she's still a human being, right? And they was like, well, the death penalty is equal. I'm like, no, it's not, because if it was equal, she wouldn't be the first woman in 19 or 200 years. I know that is a big gap. I just can't remember exactly the numbers. But if it was equally applied, she wouldn't be the first. Oh my God, I misspelled European. She wouldn't be the first, right? So these things are applied unequally because so repetitive. Because the government gets to pick and choose who these dehumanizing things are done to. And so that's why many people who are anti-death penalty, including myself, because it doesn't apply to everyone. It is a thing specifically for racialized people, and particularly men. And so when someone who is not a racialized man gets it, it's such a big like deal because it's not equal, right? And then I see this last one says ambiguous definitions of terrorism in some states have led to policies and practices that violate fundamental human freedoms of individual populations and to discriminate against particular groups. And that's just about the overall definitions I was reading. If I'm not sure if people are ever followed the Cop City, but here in Atlanta, this state's probably, I think this was referring to states as countries, but like even here in Georgia, the city of Atlanta government, which is ran by Democrats, tried to file domestic terrorism charges against Cop City protesters who were at a music festival. They didn't do anything. They even took some lawyers. I think they took a couple of reporters, and they charged them with domestic terrorism because somewhere else, some protesters were like just bothering them at the actual like place they were building Cop City. And so this was actually thrown out last month. trying to make sure my timeline is right, but the judge like pretty much laughed at this fact that they charged these random people who were at a music festival with terrorism, but they still were allowed to in that moment, even though the charges were thrown out. In that moment, in the past like years that this has been going through, these people have had domestic terrorism charges on their records. Like some people, a lot of people lost their jobs. Some people were still in prison, so they couldn't go back to work, like go back home. Like this is like a major thing, and so because the definition was so ambiguous, it was fine. And we are kind of lucky. The court system is kind of so we're kind of lucky, or they're kind of lucky that they got it. Like the judge dropped the charges, but the charge was vague enough. I mean, the definition was vague enough to at the very least give them the initial charges. I think this is the last of the slides. But yeah, this is, I think I may try to do this again, but I may not be able to do it with the presentation because for whatever reason, TikTok thinks this is not my own work. My blood, sweat, and tears from Canva. I don't know if there's any question.